Imagine waking before dawn to the distant clatter of water dripping through rotten roof boards, its steady plink-plonk echoing in the gloom like a sinister metronome. You sit up in your straw-stuffed mattress, if you're lucky enough to have on, only to feel the icy bite of damp seeping through tattered blankets. Outside, a fetid yellow haze drifts down the alley, curling around your window slit and carrying the acrid scent of coal smoke. Could you endure a single night in such a place, let alone survive the cruel light of day? London's poorest quarters offered little comfort for the weary soul. In these backstreet tenements, often former workshops, stables, or even prison cells hastily repurposed, families of 5, 6, sometimes 8 people crammed together in spaces no larger than a small sitting room. Children shared the same bedding as adults, and privacy was an alien concept. Imagine a space barely long enough to stretch your legs, where the ceiling was so low you might bump your head if you dared stand upright. By the dim glow of a single tallow candle, you would first notice the pervasive damp. The walls, coated in years of coal soot from neighbouring chimneys, wet moisture whenever the London skies opened. Jagged cracks in the plaster oozed a yellowish film of mildew, and your fingertips left smeared trails on the surface. Each breath felt heavy, as though you were inhaling the building's own decay. If you were unlucky, the roof had large holes, and rainwater pooled on rotting floorboards. You might wake to the splat of droplets on your face, or the soft squelch underfoot as you padded to the corner bucket, your makeshift chamber pot. Here, necessity trumped decorum. Once morning, light filtered through the grime-coated window. You hauled the bucket downstairs to empty it into the gutter, where it joined a foul cocktail of household waste, discarded ash from the fireplaces, and animal excrement. But the worst inhabitants of these hovels were the rats, hunched over dinner scraps, or the occasional bone fragment. Their beady eyes glowed with unholy patience. They tunneled under floorboards, slipping through gaps to feast on your meager rations, or, worse still, nibble at your toes while you slept. One trap might catch half a dozen, yet the next night you'd find twice as many scuttling about, a terrifying lesson in reproductive efficiency. Could you find the courage to face such creatures night after night? Sanitary facilities were virtually non-existent. There were no communal privies or drainage systems in these quarters, just the one bucket, emptied haphazardly, and the open gutters that choked with human filth. Fresh water came from a handful of public pumps, but even this scarce resource was often contaminated by nearby cesspits and overflowing sewers. You queued for hours, clutching your metal pail, only to return home with a murky liquid that smelled faintly of rot. In the ghostly half-light of morning, the tenement's residents stirred. Men and women shook off the last wisps of drowsiness and prepared for another grueling day. There was no gentle stretching or whispered prayers. Instead, they dressed in hand-me-down garments so warm they threatened to fall apart with the slightest tug. Children, some no older than 5 or 6, tugged on boots 2 sizes too big, their skinny legs disappearing into oversized trousers. Occasionally, you might glimpse moments of fragile hope. A neighbour who had found work in a nearby factory might bring news of a potential opening, or a travelling peddler could offer a scrap of second-hand cloth for a few pennies. Yet these sparks of possibility flickered briefly, extinguished by the ever-present spectres of hunger, disease, and despair. The tenement's narrow corridor, no wider than a coffin, served as a communal thoroughfare. Here, you'd brush shoulders with a succession of sleepy-eyed lodgers, a mother clutching a crying infant, a ragtag group of apprentices coughing from last night's coal smoke, an old man hobbling on a makeshift crutch. Each carried the same haunted look, a mixture of resignation and determination, as though survival itself had become a matter of willpower alone. Despite the squalor, a strange sense of camaraderie often blossomed among residents. On bitterly cold nights, families huddled together beneath damp quilts, pooling body heat to stave off frostbite. They whispered stories of better times, tales of kin who had emigrated to the colonies, or of a government official promising relief that never arrived. In the black of night, these whispered legends became lifelines, fragile threads of optimism woven into the fabric of misery. Yet the tenements offered no escape from the outside world's dangers. A sudden downpour turned the unpaved alley into a quagmire of mud and offal. Footsteps slipped in the muck, sending villagers plunging headfirst into gutters. And when the infamous pea-soup fog rolled in, an unnatural haze born of coal, fumes trapped in low-lying mist, visibility dropped to mere inches. Residents drew their shawls tight, stumbled blindly to work, and prayed they would not cough themselves to death before reaching the factory gates. Here, in these dark dwellings, survival demanded constant vigilance. A single misstep, leaving a pail unemptied, forgetting to patch a leaky rafter, could invite an unholy visitation of rats, water damage, or disease. And yet, with astonishing resilience, families endured. They learned to patch their walls with rags, to mix peat and coal dust into cake for breakfast, to invent songs that masked the rattle of fever chills. So now, as the first golden rays of dawn fight through the grime, you pause at the threshold of your wretched lodging. You've witnessed the horrors of these subterranean shelters and felt the bite of damp decay on your skin. The question remains, do you possess the grit to face another day in Victorian London's underbelly? Have you ever seen a day so thick, with fog that the world vanished into a silent, yellow-grey void? In Victorian London, that was not a poetic flourish, it was a deadly reality. As you stepped onto the cobblestones, the city's notorious pea-soup smog wrapped around you like a choking blanket, each breath a gamble with your very lungs. Coal was the lifeblood of the Industrial Revolution, fueling factories, locomotives, and home fires. Yet every ton burned unleashed plumes of sulfur dioxide, unburned carbon, and ash into the atmosphere. When these pollutants mingled with the city's natural mist, fed by the Thames's damp breezes, the result was a toxic soup so dense you could scarcely see your own feet. Morning routines faltered. Shopkeepers stumbled to unlock doors, blinking against the acrid sting that filled their eyes. Carriage drivers blinked through shutter-like goggles, their horses snorting in protest as coal-laden droplets rained down upon their flanks. Pedestrians donned improvised masks, gauze handkerchiefs dampened in vinegar or urine, which they believed could neutralize the worst odors. Yet no fabric barrier could filter out microscopic soot particles that lodged deep within the lungs. In the thickest pea-soup episodes, daylight surrendered to an eerie twilight. Street lamps flickered on at noon. Church bells echoed from invisible towers. A hush fell as even the rowdiest cries of street vendors were muffled by the fog's suffocating embrace. The Thames, usually a ribbon of steel-grey water, disappeared behind a curtain of noxious haze, its murky surface reflecting only the gloom above. Health consequences were immediate and grim. Victorians called the persistent cough of smog victims London cough, but bronchitis, asthma, and chronic respiratory infections were rampant. Records from the Royal College of Physicians in the 1870s document surges in hospital admissions whenever smogs descended. Doctors prescribed laudanum to calm inflammation, a dangerous opium tincture that dulled pain but carried its own risks of addiction and overdose. Children were especially vulnerable. Picture a little girl wrapped in woolen scarves, her face hidden beneath a veil of blackened cloth, as she clutched her mother's hand while gasping for each breath. School attendance plummeted during dense fog weeks. Many parents kept their sickly offspring at home, too weak to leave their beds. Pneumonia claimed thousands. Death certificates sometimes listed asphyxia or inhalation of foul air as the official cause. Work did not halt for the fog. Factory whistles still blew, demanding labourers clock in on time or face wage deductions. Inside mills, the smog infiltrated every seam and ventilator, settling on machinery, coating workers' hair, skin, and lungs with a fine soot-like powder. Spinning rooms and foundries became poisonous chambers where every inhale carried a small dose of sulfuric acid. Merchants on the docks were no strangers to the smog's wrath. As steamships disgorged their cargoes of coal and timber, the riverside air grew thicker still. Sailors coughed into their collars, fumbling with mooring lines slick with grime. Cargo manifests were stained with oily fingerprints, and goods, especially fabrics and leather, arrived tarnished by the pervasive soot. At street level, poverty and smog formed a vicious cycle. The poorest neighborhoods, often downwind of factories or coal depots, bore the brunt of pollution. Rent was cheaper, but the cost came in the form of ruined health. Wealthier Londoners retreated to the suburban outskirts when episodes peaked, fleeing the city's core like frightened prey. Horse-drawn omnibuses ferried the well-to-do out of the smog belt, leaving the destitute to face the suffocating air alone. Efforts to combat the haze were piecemeal at best. The Metropolitan Board of Works installed smoke-consuming apparatuses on factory chimneys, rudimentary devices that trapped larger particles but did little against the microscopic fumes. In 1863, the Smoke Abatement Act outlawed the use of raw coal in certain districts, but enforcement was lax and loopholes abounded. Merchants loaded ships with smokeless Welsh coal, but its scarcity and cost limited widespread adoption. By the 1880s, journalists began to call for bolder action. Pioneering reporters described black rain falling from the sky, transforming white garments into grimy rags. Editorials in the Times lamented the miasma of modern industry, while physicians urged the government to regulate coal quality and expand green spaces as natural air purifiers. Yet real reform was slow, hindered by economic priorities and public indifference. Still, the smog era did produce glimmers of innovation. Palatial glass conservatories, like those in Kew Gardens, offered temporary refuges of pure air filled with exotic plants that filtered pollutants. Early experiments with electric street lighting reduced fire consumption of coal gas. And at certain hospitals, experimental smoke wards featured air drawn from elevated intakes, away from ground-level grime. Despite these efforts, the killer smog persisted, lurking behind every sunrise. For the poor, there was no escape, no country estate to retreat to, no private carriage to shield them. Each day was a gamble. Breathe too deeply, and you risked a lifetime of chronic illness. Breathe too lightly, and panic set in. So, as you stand at your tenement's threshold, inhaling that first toxic breath of dawn, ask yourself, could you endure the relentless haze of Victorian London, where the very air conspired to snuff out your life? Dawn breaks over the back streets of Victorian London, but breakfast here is not a leisurely ritual. It is a desperate scramble for the barest sustenance. Picture yourself standing before a battered wooden table, your stomach knotting with hunger as you clutch a chipped tin bowl. What would you give for a hot meal, and how far would you go to claim it? For London's destitute, the first meal of the day was often the hardest to secure. Unlike today's bustling cafes and corner bakeries, the 19th century working, poor-faced meagre options, a thin, watery gruel, a piece of stale bread scraped clean of crumbs, or nothing at all. Wealthy households might start the day with eggs, bacon, and tea, lavish fare that seemed as distant as another world to those in the city's shadows. In countless overcrowded tenements, a large cauldron of gruel, made from oats or barley boiled in water, simmered overnight. By sunrise, its contents resembled dishwater dotted with floating grains. For a halfpenny or a few crusts of bread, a family could share a single ladleful. Gruel kitchens, often run by charitable churches or soup societies, opened their doors at first light. Long lines formed in alleyways slick with damp, and the wait could last an hour or more in biting air. Gruel was far from appetizing. Its texture, somewhere between porridge and broth, clung to the tongue with a glue-like resistance. Scalding hot, it left burns on unprotected lips. Cooled too quickly, it thickened into a congealed mass that threatened to choke the unaccustomed. Many added a pinch of salt or, if they were lucky, a sprinkle of onion skins for flavor. Sugar and milk were extravagant luxuries, reserved for charity events or rare holidays. Bread, the other staple, came in loaves baked just once or twice weekly. Bakers sold end slices, hard, crusty heels, at a discount. Shaped like wedges, these stale pieces required soaking in water or gruel to soften. Children bit through the tough exterior with grim determination, their jaws working double, time to extract any morsel worth chewing. When bread ran out, families resorted to baked potato skins or weeds boiled into a thin soup. The 1860s and 1870s saw a proliferation of so-called soup kitchens, funded by philanthropic industrialists, and religious groups alarmed by reports of widespread starvation. In some districts, these kitchens served peas and potato broth, seasoned with salt pork, offering a fleeting taste of warmth and nourishment. A single free meal could stave off hunger pangs for hours, but entry often required a dour registration, process, fingerprinting, or a voucher, measures designed to deter idleness. Even with these safeguards, demand far outstripped supply. A handwritten ledger from St. Martin in the Fields records serving over 1,200 bowls of soup on a single bitter morning. Recipients included the elderly, the injured, and the unemployed. Many endured humiliation at the mercy of dole masters, who doled out portions based on moral judgments rather than need. Could you swallow your pride to stand in that line, shivering beneath the unrelenting drizzle? For those who could scrape together a few pennies, a bakery's window offered hope. A halfpenny loaf promised several thin slices, but the cost of flour and fuel pushed prices higher whenever harvests failed. In lean years, workers diverted part of their wages, earned in grueling factories or on construction sites, straight to the baker's tally. This left little for rent, clothing, or medical care. A halfpenny might secure enough bread for breakfast, but what about dinner or tomorrow's meal? Children bore the brunt of this insecurity. Many started their day without breakfast at all, trudging to workhouses or factories with empty stomachs. Hunger sapped their strength and dulled their concentration. Yet employers demanded unwavering productivity. In textile mills, undernourished, youngsters grew drowsy at their looms. Supervisors threatened whipping for sluggish performance. Could you imagine learning to read and write through a haze of gnawing emptiness? When charity failed or money ran out, some Londoners turned to the margins of society for sustenance. Street scavengers, often the elderly or physically disabled, followed along behind horse-drawn carts, collecting fallen oats, barley, and grain spilled from sacks. Others foraged in city parks or along the Thames embankment, plucking dandelion leaves and nettles to boil into a bitter tea. Mudlarks, typically children aged 10 to 14, combed riverbanks at low tide for mussel shells, oyster remains, or edible seaweed. These scraps, when boiled or roasted over makeshift fires, provided essential calories. Yet this life brimmed with danger, swift tides, collapsing wharfs, and the ever-present threat of arrest for trespassing. What lengths would you go to fill your belly when every cookhouse door remained closed? Even those with steady wages found breakfast a compromise. Domestic servants in middle-class homes ate in stark back kitchens, often scavenging leftovers from their employer's table. They might sip a cup of weak tea and nibble a crust of bread before starting their day. Apprentices and clerks shared cramped quarters in boarding houses, where breakfasts of tea and dry toast masked a simmering resentment at their meagre lot. Food vendors cloaked in woolen shawls hawked penny pies and hot coffee at street corners. A meat pie, filled with scraps of cheap beef and fat, offered momentary comfort but was heavy on grease and light on nourishment. Coffee, a rare treat, still carried a stigma of extravagance. Many preferred ale or watered-down porter to chase. Away morning chills, hunger shaped every decision. Parents rationed their shares to feed children first, knowing that a malnourished child could weaken beyond recovery. When a family earned a sudden windfall, a Christmas bonus, or a shipment of seasonal fruit, they celebrated with a feast of dried apples or plum pudding. These joyous days shone as beacons in lives otherwise defined by scarcity. Yet for many, those beacons dimmed quickly. The malnutrition contributed to stunted growth, weakened immunity, and increased vulnerability to disease. Rickets, scurvy, and beriberi stalked the underfed. A report from a London infirmary notes a child so weakened by hunger that he slept through his meal, turning from the warmed bowl with no will to eat. Despite the grim statistics, a quiet heroism emerged among the starving. Neighbours shared morsels of bread, dividing it equally among households. When a coal delivery arrived at a tenement, families pooled pence to purchase a sack of briquettes, warming their rooms and keeping gruel simmering longer. In church halls, amateur cooks baked batches of seed cakes, dense loaves laced with poppy seeds that sustained hundreds of families for days. A young labourer once described his morning gruel as cold comfort, yet he credited it with giving him the strength to toil through the sweltering heat of a foundry furnace. A mother, clutching her pint-sized pot of soup, whispered a silent prayer that tomorrow's meal would be just as warm, and perhaps just a little more filling. By the time the city heaved fully awake, the poor had already battled their most fundamental enemy: hunger. Their breakfasts were not feasts but necessities, each morsel a lifeline in a world that offered little mercy. As you close this chapter on starving Londoners, consider the toll of a single missed meal, and the fortitude required to press onward, day after day, spoon after spoon. Step outside your tenement, and the very ground beneath your feet feels treacherous, slick with mud, strewn with refuse, and caked in horse manure so thick that the hoofprints hold water like miniature ponds. Could you navigate these alleys at dawn, your boots sinking with every step, the stench rising in waves to choke your senses? In Victorian London, the concept of a clean street was virtually non-existent. Cobblestones, intended to provide solid footing, were often laid over decades of accumulated muck. Rain turned the unpaved lanes into quagmires of slippery clay, where wheel ruts and hoof tracks filled with a noxious broth of decomposing waste. Every downpour threatened to transform the thoroughfares into rivers of brown sludge, carrying with them fragments of discarded peelings, torn scraps of fabric, and the dark remnants of last night's chamber pot evacuation. Horses were the engines of urban life, pulling omnibuses, hauling coal, delivering goods, and ferrying patrons to music halls. Yet each animal produced between 15 and 35 pounds of dung per day. Thousands of horses roamed the streets, leaving behind a feast for flies and a breeding ground for pathogens. In warm weather, the manure dried into a dusty powder that coated lungs when kicked up. In cooler months, it congealed into slick clumps that adhered to boots and cartwheels alike. Picture a vendor balancing a tray of freshly baked pies on his head, only to have a passing carriage send a spray of manure across his wares. Or imagine a mother clutching her child as they cross the road, each hurried step risking a fall into a hidden gutter, the infant's new dress soiled instantly by brown splatter. Could you bear the humiliation of wiping off your only decent pair of shoes with a rag rent from your sleeve? Beneath the visible mess lay another hazard: open gullies that served as primitive sewers. Running alongside the curb, these channels collected rainwater, household wastewater, and chamber pot contents emptied directly from upstairs windows. Without proper covers, they teemed with rats, maggots, and disease-causing bacteria. Pedestrians often had to hop from stone to cross, praying their foot didn't slip into the fetid flow. Children turned the gutters into playgrounds, splashing through the filth in search of lost coins or discarded scraps of food. They christened impromptu paper boats and set them afloat, cheering as the currents carried them away. Yet play had its price. A single misjudged leap could land a child knee-deep in raw sewage, requiring a night spent shivering by a low fire, clothes damp and rotting with foul moisture. Above all, London's streets assaulted the nose, the mingled. Odours of urine, manure, rotting fish from market stalls, and stagnant water created a miasma that clung to hair, clothes, and skin. Residents learned to pinch their nostrils or cover their faces with a cloth, but such measures offered little comfort. Street cries, hot cod and chips, or fresh oysters, echoed through the haze, but the aromas of fresh food were all but obliterated by the city's omnipresent stench. On market days, the crowds gathered around open carts, piled high with fruit, vegetables, and salted meats. Traders competed for attention with loud boasts of quality, yet buyers hesitated to approach too closely, wary of turning backs to the sludge-laden gutters. Fishmongers thrown off balance by a misstep sometimes lost their entire catch to the filth, condemning them to either wash the fish in contaminated water or abandon them altogether. The well-to-do avoided the worst of it by travelling in covered, handsome cabs or private carriages, their wheels elevated above the worst ruts. But for the working poor, daily commute meant risking boots, often their sole pair, and health. Bystanders jostled one another to find a firmer patch of ground, elbows swinging, curses flying as they endeavoured to cross the street without sinking ankle-deep. In winter, the mud froze into treacherous ice, and accidents soared, broken limbs, sprained ankles, and head wounds requiring rudimentary care in understaffed infirmaries. Bridges spanning the Thames presented additional obstacles. Wooden planks worn smooth by centuries of traffic became lethal when coated in mud and spilled oil from passing barge lamps. Street cleaners, employed by local vestries, swept the thoroughfares with long-handled brooms, but they could never keep pace with the relentless influx of waste. Some cleaners were rumoured to dump collected muck into side streets under cover of darkness, merely shifting the problem elsewhere. The filth was more than an aesthetic horror. It was a vector for disease. Cholera epidemics of the 1830s and 1840s highlighted the connection between sewage and sickness, though official recognition came slowly. Areas with the worst drainage and heaviest manure accumulation saw mortality rates skyrocket during outbreaks. Physicians and pioneering sanitary reformers, like Edwin Chadwick, lobbied for comprehensive sewer systems, but entrenched interests, and the cost of large-scale infrastructure stalled progress. In the meantime, Londoners tried home remedies, burning tar to fumigate the air, or carrying oranges and lemons to mask odours. Wealthy families kept pasteurised milk and clean linens, while the poor relied on stale bread and old clothes pressed from earlier, cleaner times. Without regulation, slaughterhouses operated near residential zones, adding animal blood and offal to the street mixture. Abattoir waste sometimes overflowed into the gutters, a crimson tide that stained cobbles and terrified residents. Yet, amid the grime, Londoners adapted. Bootblacks positioned themselves at strategic corners, offering to scrape the thickest mud from work boots for a penny. Children formed mud brigades, linking arms to navigate the worst crossings in step, passing buckets of water retrieved from communal pumps to wash each other's shoes. Gatehouses to wealthier neighbourhoods installed stone slabs, called paving stones, so pedestrians could bypass the worst stretches. Some innovative employers provided mud rooms at factory entrances, small enclosures where workers scraped, wiped, and hosed off their boots before clocking in. These spaces featured rough boards for drying and communal brushes for scraping away the worst caked-on muck. Though rudimentary, they reduced workplace accidents caused by slipping on oily factory floors. By the late 1850s, public awareness grew. Newspaper illustrations exposed Victorian readers to stark contrasts between the opulent West End and the squalid East. Sanitary commissions conducted surveys, mapping death rates against street conditions. The Metropolitan Board of Works, under the direction of Sir Joseph Bazalgette, began constructing the London sewer network, one of history's grandest engineering feats. When the Great Stink of 1858 finally prompted Parliament to act, the stench in the Houses of Commons became impossible to ignore. Still, these reforms took decades to implement fully. For London's poorest, the benefits arrived slowly. Sections of the new sewers bypassed their neighbourhoods, leaving many streets unchanged well into the 1870s. Until then, survival meant mastering the art of dodging dung heaps, hopping across open gullies, and keeping one's wits about them in a world where every step could invite calamity. As you stare at the mire before you, cobbles slick, gutters overflowing, horses waiting in their own circles of grime, ask yourself, could you master these streets? Or would the filth and chaos swallow you whole? Dawn's first light found London's factories already roaring to life. Huge brick edifices belching smoke, their windows glowing like dull embers. Inside, the air vibrated with the thunder of machinery, and every worker, man, woman, and child, faced a day measured not in hours but in the relentless rhythm of gears and steam. Would you dare stand on those factory floors, your muscles aching before breakfast, every breath heavy with dust and heat? By the mid-19th century, the textile revolution had transformed Britain into the workshop of the world. Cotton, mills and spinning factories sprouted along the Thames and its tributaries, drawing labourers from rural villages in search of meagre wages. These immense buildings, sometimes 5 or 6 stories tall, housed rows of power looms and spinning machines, all driven by steam engines that hissed and throbbed day and night. Stepping inside felt like entering a living beast, pistons pumping, belts whirring, shafts spinning at dizzying speeds. The pounding of shuttles created a constant percussion so loud that workers had to shout to be heard, or simply resign themselves to working in silence, their ears ringing long after the whistle blew for the day's end. Perhaps the most scandalous aspect of Victorian industry was its reliance on child labour. Boys and girls as young as 5 or 6 were pressed into service, their nimble fingers perfect for guiding delicate threads through narrow machine parts. Employers prized these small workers, paying them as little as 1/6 of an adult's wage, while extracting labour far beyond their physical capacity. Imagine a 10-year-old girl crouched beside a massive spinning mule, her arms stretched to reach the polished brass fittings. Each time the machine stopped, sometimes every few minutes, she had to reposition hundreds of spindles, her fingers slick with grease and palms reddened by friction. Supervisors paced the aisles, cracking whips or wielding metal rulers to punish any tardiness or mistake. Could you endure that relentless pace, day after day, until your body hunched and your spirit dimmed? There were no weekends, no 8-hour workday, and certainly no safety regulations to speak of. Most factories expected a minimum of 12-hour shifts, often stretching to 16 hours during peak seasons. Workers arrived before sunrise, some trudging through smog, others stumbling in half-sleep, to clock in at puncture card machines or simply report to foreman. Breaks were few and far between. A short pause for midday gruel, served in a corner pots and pans huddle, might last half an hour at best. A quick swallow of watery soup or a chunk of bread barely registered as sustenance before supervisors barked orders to return to the machines. Feet swelled in cramped shoes, and backs ached from stooping over low benches or climbing narrow staircases between floors. Danger lurked in every corner. Gears and cogs swung with murderous force. Loose clothing could be snatched in an instant, dragging a worker into grinding steel. Sawdust and cotton fibers filled the air, coating lungs until every breath felt like inhaling microparticles of stone. Fires, fueled by overheated boilers and tangled oil-soaked rags, broke out regularly, turning entire mills into death traps. In November 1871, the catastrophic Tooley Street fire began in a warehouse near London Bridge, eventually consuming millions of pounds worth of cotton goods and oil. As flames roared, factory workers, locked in by management to prevent theft, fought for their lives, some leaping from windows into safety nets held by fellow labourers. Such tragedies underscored the brutal reality. Industry prized profit over people. Working women bore a double burden. After a full day at the loom, they returned home to cook, clean, and care for children in cramped quarters. Their wages, often slightly higher than children's, but still a fraction of men's, were yoked to family survival. A teenage daughter might replace her mother on the factory floor so her mother could fetch water or nurse an ailing sibling. In some workshops, family systems prevailed. Whole families, including infants strapped to mothers' backs, worked, side by side in cottage industries, hand-spinning yarn or sewing garments. But in the sprawling urban mills, such accommodations were rare. New mothers often abandoned infants at workhouse doors, unable to balance nursing with the ceaseless demands of machinery. Despite oppressive conditions, murmurs of dissent began to stir. Early trade unions, though illegal until the 1870s, sprang from workers' desperation for fair wages and safer hours. Secret meetings in back rooms and taverns allowed textile workers and dockhands to share grievances. Handbills circulated, urging solidarity, but fear of blacklisting and police raids kept many voices muted. In 1842, the Mines Act outlawed underground work for women and children under 10, a small victory signalling that reform was possible. Yet factory acts regulating hours and ages were piecemeal and poorly enforced. A 1847 amendment limited children aged 13-18 to a 10-hour day, but loopholes let employers shuffle juvenile labour between departments to circumvent the law. Could the legal system protect you, or would economic pressures nullify every reform? Within the mechanical cacophony, workers found brief respites. During the half-hour meal break, they shared morsels of cold meat, swapped melodies hummed softly over rhythmic clinks, or whispered stories of distant villages. Some crafted talismans, small wooden crosses or woven ribbons, believing these would shield them from factory accidents. Older workers mentored newcomers, teaching them how to oil machinery judiciously or extract stubborn thread snarls without halting operations. Veteran sweepers, tasked with cleaning floors during brief downtime, became unofficial safety officers, using bucketfuls of water to knock dust from belts and prevent overheating. By evening, factory floors emptied of exhausted bodies. Workers retraced their steps through the smog, their lungs aching, ears ringing, and muscles trembling. Injuries, lice infestations, fractured limbs, chronic coughs marked them as they shuffled home. Families struggled to care for disabled members, pooling limited funds for makeshift remedies. Mental health suffered too. The relentless grind bred hopelessness, and in some, a jittery hyper-alertness that outlasted the workday. Workers spoke of factory fever, a state of perpetual anxiety, fueled by the fear of a single slip or machine malfunction. Some turned to cheap gin or opium to dull the pain, deepening cycles of dependency and impoverishment. Yet strikes and petitions began to yield change. In 1878, the Factory and Workshops Act extended regulations, mandating basic ventilation and safety fencing around dangerous machinery. By the 1890s, some enlightened mill owners introduced midday breaks and modest wages, spurred by productivity bonuses. Visiting inspectors, armed with notebooks and measuring sticks, ventured onto factory floors, their presence a reminder that governmental oversight had arrived. These reforms, though limited, signaled a shift in public conscience. Newspapers published exposés of child slaves in cotton mills, while reformers like Lord Shaftesbury championed laws to protect the vulnerable. Slowly, the gears of industry began to grind, not only for profit, but, however grudgingly, for human dignity. As the day's final whistle shrieks, imagine stepping off the factory floor with limbs heavy as lead and lungs burning from dust-choked air. You've witnessed how labour in Victorian London was both a lifeline and a torment, forcing even children to bear the weight of progress. Do you possess the resilience to endure such back-breaking toil? Or would you, too, dream of a world where machinery served humanity, not the other way around? Imagine the chill of early morning seeping into your bones, not from cold air, but from the dread of disease lurking unseen in every droplet of water and every cough in the night. In Victorian London, illness was as omnipresent as the smog, a silent predator that struck without warning, and often without mercy. How would you navigate a world where the doctor's cure could kill you as swiftly as the disease itself? London's overcrowded streets and squalid living conditions created a fertile breeding ground for plagues. Cholera, typhoid, and smallpox swept through neighbourhoods with terrifying speed, carried by contaminated water, poor sanitation, and air heavy with pathogens. In the Great Stink of 1858, the Thames, London's lifeblood, stank so foul that Parliament debated relocation rather than reform. That same water, drawn by hand pumps into every family's home, harboured Vibrio cholerae, turning a simple drink into a death sentence. An outbreak typically started with sudden diarrhea and vomiting, followed by rapid dehydration and collapse. Families watched helplessly as loved ones withered away, often within hours of appearing healthy. Mortality rates soared in the poorest districts, where the gutters ran free with sewage and open-air markets teemed with tainted produce. Could you bear to see a mother clutch her child's lifeless body, powerless to stop the invisible killer? Doctors in the mid-1800s were a far cry from today's well-trained physicians. Many practitioners were barber surgeons, men who earned part of their income cutting hair and part from performing crude operations. Without antiseptics or anesthesia, surgical tools were sterilized, if at all, in boiling water or alcohol, and operations were excruciating affairs. Picture a patient strapped to a wooden board as a surgeon carved into flesh with a bone saw to amputate a gangrenous limb, blood spurted with every stroke, the patient howling in agony. Cloth soaked in chloroform or ether might dull the pain, but its availability was limited, and overdoses were common. Death came not just from the original wound, but from infection, blood loss, or an errant prescription. When reliable medical care was scarce, Londoners turned to quacks and patent medicines peddled on street corners. Signs shouted promises of miraculous cures. Dr. Grimshaw's elixir for consumption, or Lady Ashworth's tonic, restores youth and vigour. These concoctions, often heavy with alcohol, opium, or toxic substances like mercury and arsenic, provided fleeting relief but wreaked havoc on the body. A favourite remedy for coughs and chest infections was laudanum, a potent opium tincture that eased pain and induced sleep, but fostered addiction. Daily doses dulled emotional and physical suffering, but left users dependent, their health eroding even as they chased relief. Arsenic-based tonics, marketed for improving complexion, led to chronic poisoning, symptoms of which included vomiting, diarrhea, and nerve damage. Hospitals offered scant comfort. Institutions like the St. Bartholomew's Hospital admitted thousands annually, but beds were crowded, wards poorly ventilated, and hygiene almost non-existent. Floors were straw-strewn, bedding rarely changed, and chamber pots shared among dozens of patients. Mortality rates for infections remained dangerously high. Enterprising nurses, some inspired by Florence Nightingale's work during the Crimean War, began advocating for sanitation reforms. She championed clean water, adequate ventilation, and regular linen changes. However, her ideas met resistance from hospital boards wary of increased costs. In many wards, patients lay shoulder to shoulder, their moans echoing off stone walls, as disease spread unchecked. Amidst the formal medical system, folk healers and wise women practiced ancient remedies passed down through generations. They brewed herbal teas from elderflower, willow bark, and peppermint to ease fevers and aches. A pinch of dried foxglove, digitalis, could slow a racing heart, while poultices of bread and milk soothed wounds. Yet superstition also thrived. Some believed that a coin pressed to the forehead could draw out illness, or that tying a red ribbon around the wrist warded off the evil eye. Apocryphal tales spoke of mystical healers, cunning folk who could cure with a whispered charm or a hand-carved talisman. In a city awash with uncertainty, these practices offered psychological comfort, if not physical cure. The 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act sought to deter reliance on public aid by forcing the destitute into workhouses, dreary institutions where the able-bodied laboured in exchange for meagre meals and basic shelter. Sick inmates were housed in infirmaries, where conditions could be as dire as on the streets. Overcrowding, lack of trained staff, and minimal supplies turned these infirmaries into breeding grounds for more disease. Yet for some, they were the only option. A starving family might choose starvation or the stigma of the workhouse. Once inside, they surrendered autonomy, subjected to harsh discipline and stripped of possessions. The medical care, though minimal, offered a flicker of hope, a chance to survive long enough to reclaim some semblance of freedom. Despite rampant challenges, seeds of modern medicine were sown in Victorian London. John Snow's investigation of the Broad Street cholera outbreak in 1854 demonstrated the waterborne nature of the disease, leading to improved water supplies and eventual piped water systems. His removal of a contaminated pump handle was an early triumph for epidemiology. The Metropolitan Asylums Board, established in 1867, opened specialized fever hospitals to isolate and treat infectious patients. These facilities, including the London Fever Hospital, reduced transmission rates by separating cases from general wards. Vaccination campaigns for smallpox gained traction after the Vaccination Act of 1853, though skepticism and religious objections slowed widespread adoption. Consider the tale of Mary, a washerwoman who caught typhoid after drinking water from a polluted pump. Too poor for a private doctor, she relied on laudanum and a herbalist's tea. Weak and delirious, she was rescued by a charitable nurse who nursed her back to strength, teaching her hygiene practices that kept her family safe. Mary's gratitude knew no bounds. She later volunteered at a local clinic, sharing her hard-won knowledge. Then there was Thomas, a blacksmith's apprentice who survived a horrific workshop accident. His arm trapped in a belt-driven machine. Denied proper surgical care at a workhouse infirmary, he turned to a barber surgeon who amputated the limb without anesthetic. Thomas endured weeks of fever, but emerged determined to advocate for better medical training, eventually working alongside reformers to improve surgical standards. In the dim light of a candle, you trace a path through cobblestone alleys to a humble apothecary, your trusted source for cure and counsel. Yet in this era, medicine was as much trial and error as science, and every remedy carried risk. As you ponder the blurred line between healer and harm, ask yourself, would you trust the cures of Victorian London, or would fear of the quack's poison drive you mad before any disease could? Beyond the misery of damp tenements and toxic air, another threat lurked in the shadows: human predators preying on the weak and desperate. In Victorian London, survival sometimes meant outwitting the living and the dead. Would you trust the sanctity of a grave, or could your corpse become a commodity? In an era before widespread anatomical donation, medical schools craved cadavers for dissection. The law, however, permitted only the bodies of executed criminals for anatomical study, and the supply fell woefully short of demand. Enter the resurrection men, grave robbers who exhumed fresh corpses under cover of darkness and sold them to surgeons for profit. Imagine your family's horror. A relative dies. You arrange a humble burial in an overrun cemetery, and by dawn, their coffin is empty. These men, often former soldiers or dock workers, eased headstones aside and lifted coffins with rudimentary tools. They worked swiftly, for time was of the essence. Decomposition set in, and word of missing bodies spread quickly. To counteract this threat, some cemeteries installed mort safes, heavy iron cages encircling fresh graves, or employed guards to patrol moonlit grounds. Wealthier families paid to vault their dead in brick-lined vaults or secure charnel houses. Yet the poor lacked such protections, leaving loved ones vulnerable to desecration. Could you rest easy knowing your final rest might be stolen for profit? Simultaneously, London's overcrowded neighbourhoods gave rise to street gangs who treated the city's alleys as their territory. The notorious The 40 Elephants, an all-female shoplifting gang, plucked silk satchels from upscale shoppers, their nimble fingers slipping under cloaks and into shopping baskets. Meanwhile, male gangs like the Ratcliffe Highway Rovers specialised in robbery and violence, preying on travellers along dimly lit docks. Children, too, were recruited into gang ranks, their small stature ideal for slipping through crowded markets to snatch coins or badges. Ragged trousers and patched jackets became uniforms of the streetwise youth, their loyalty to a gang often offering more protection than any family could. Initiation rites included dares to pilfer from policemen's holsters or taunt rival members, binding them to a life of petty crime. The busy thoroughfares of Whitechapel and Covent Garden teemed with pickpockets who earned their living by lightening pockets and purses. With deft sleight of hand, they relieved victims of money, letters, or even keys, often without the slightest notice. Tourists from the countryside, unaccustomed to urban crowds, found themselves victims of deft fienders slipping behind their backs. Meanwhile, con artists perfected elaborate scams. A smooth-talking gentleman in a top hat might distract passers-by with a sob story, while an accomplice swept their pockets clean. Elaborate confidence tricks, like the gold bar swindle, where a fake assayer duped victims into buying worthless metal, flourished in the fog-shrouded streets. Could you spot the mark, or would you fall prey to the next elaborate ruse? The Metropolitan Police, established in 1829, struggled to maintain order amid swelling crime rates. Commissaries patrolled in pairs, their blue tailcoats and top hats a modest deterrent to hardened criminals. Yet corruption seeped through the ranks. Officers sometimes turned a blind eye to known fences in exchange for a share of stolen goods. In 1841, the scandal of detective division officers taking bribes from gangs rocked public confidence. Reformers demanded oversight, resulting in stricter regulations and the formation of specialized units like the Criminal Investigation Department in 1878. Still, the police force remained understaffed, with one constable per 600 residents in some districts. For the destitute, crime could be a necessary evil. A single stolen loaf of bread might feed a family for a day. A pilfered watch could fetch enough pennies to cover rent. Yet the stakes were high. Theft carried the threat of transportation to Australia or a stint in the hulks. Decommissioned ships, where convicts served hard labour. Public hangings at Newgate and Tyburn served as grisly spectacles, intended to deter would-be criminals, but often attracting morbid curiosity rather than reform. The alleyways themselves offered hideouts. A common tactic: vanish through a secret door behind a shop's fireplace, or slip down a narrow passage known only to locals. Safe houses disguised as abandoned warehouses provided temporary refuge, while gang leaders negotiated with innkeepers to secure beds in basements well off the main roads. Could you navigate this underworld without a guide? Amid rampant crime, neighborhood watch groups, though unofficial, sprang up. Men wielding wooden clubs patrolled their streets, eager to break up fights or chase off pickpockets. Yet such vigilante justice was a double-edged sword. Innocent bystanders sometimes suffered beatings in the frenzy to punish malefactors. One famous case involved the lynching of a suspected child molester in 1865. A crowd gathered outside the man's lodging, accusations flying. When the police arrived, they found the suspect's body mutilated, a gruesome warning that popular justice could be swift and unforgiving. In the eyes of many poor Londoners, official law was too slow. Mob rule offered immediate, if brutal, reprisal. Despite pervasive crime, communities forged networks of mutual support. Shopkeepers formed informal agreements to ban known thieves, refusing service to anyone with a suspicious record. School teachers offered daytime supervision for children too poor to enroll in formal schools, shielding them from gang recruiters. Churches hosted night shelters, where the homeless could sleep and receive a hot meal, though only after enduring moral lectures on sin and redemption. Tales of compassion also abound. A gang leader known as Blackjack reportedly protected children in his turf, ensuring they weren't drawn into his crew, but instead pointed toward charitable institutions. And a lodger's home once, notorious for illicit dealings, became a sanctuary for unwed mothers after a hostelry disaster displaced dozens of women. Could you find trust amid suspicion? As darkness falls over London's tangled maze of alleys, the line between predator and prey blurs. You've seen how both the living and the dead became commodities in this unforgiving city. Now, faced with the threat of grave robbers, pickpockets, and vengeful mobs, ask yourself, how would you survive when law and order offer little protection? After hours spent shivering under damp quilts, braving rats and smog, imagine stepping through a battered doorway into the warm glow of a crowded pub. The mingled aromas of stale ale, simmering stew, and burning coal embrace you like a long-lost friend. In the heart of Victorian London's misery, could these humble havens offer more than just a pint and a meal? Could they restore your very spirit? Tucked amid narrow alleys and tenement blocks, the neighbourhood pub served as a communal hearth. Its low ceilings and rough-hewn wooden beams bore witness to countless tales of hardship and hope. A battered sign swung above the entrance, a painted tankard or a stag's head, beckoning weary souls to come inside. Within, the aroma of porter and roasted onions mingled with the earthy scent of damp boots drying by the hearth. Men and women jostled for standing room at the bar, clutching pewter tankards filled from gleaming brass taps. The barkeeper, often a stern matron or genial landlord, knew every customer by name, listening to whispered news of work opportunities or sickness in the family. In return for a few pennies, patrons found more than liquid warmth. They found empathy. Could you have dared to share your troubles with strangers, laying bare your fears over the clink of mugs? Food in these refugees was simple but nourishing. A thick beef and barley stew bubbled over an open hearth, its broth laced with salt pork and seasonal vegetables. Carved bread dipped into the hearty liquid provided calories and comfort. For a halfpenny, or sometimes in exchange for a favour, like singing a verse of a popular ballad, hungry lodgers took their fill before returning to their bleak quarters. Soup kitchens and charitable coffee rooms also dotted the city, often linked to religious missions. Here, volunteers ladled pea-soup and coffee for free, urging visitors to join prayers or listen to sermons afterward. While some viewed these efforts as coercive, many relieved souls welcomed the hot meal more than the spiritual pitch. After all, a filled stomach allowed room for reflection and perhaps the spark of faith. In one dim corner of the pub, a fiddler might coax notes from a battered fiddle, filling the room with lilting jigs and mournful laments. Occasionally, a street performer, harpist or hurdy-gurdy player took centre stage, passing a hat for coins. Laughter erupted over bawdy sea shanties, and travellers shared tales of distant ports and grand cities. Music offered a rare escape from the grind. A chorus of voices joining in chorus transformed tired faces, if only for a moment. Could you resist tapping your foot or humming along, forgetting the damp walls and early mornings? These fleeting respites pulled communities closer, forging bonds that outlasted hunger and fear. Beyond pubs, some families opened their doors to those in dire need. A Good Samaritan house might be little more than a small parlour with twin chairs and a kettle, but its warm welcome meant everything. Neighbours traded shifts to watch over sick children, lending blankets or sharing tuberculin salves passed down from previous generations. These acts of kindness cost nothing but yielded precious dividends: trust, solidarity, and shared resilience. In times of outbreak, cholera or typhoid, a discreet network of helpers carried food and water to quarantined households. Risking contagion, they offered more than sustenance. They provided human contact in an era when illness often meant isolation and shame. Could you find the courage to cross a threshold marked with quarantine straw, braving your own fears to comfort a stranger? Even amid the bleakest winters, Londoners seized moments of celebration, parish fetes and street fairs, sponsored by local churches or charitable guilds, filled cobblestone squares with makeshift stalls. Candlelit booths offered gingerbread men and sugared almonds. Acrobats tumbled across hay bales, and puppet shows entertained restless children. On special occasions, Queen Victoria's birthday or a royal wedding, streets were festooned with bunting, and communal tables groaned under roasted joints and homemade pies. Well-to-do patrons often donated barrels of ale and barrels of bread to share. For a few hours, the rigid boundary between classes blurred. Labourers danced with shopkeepers, and ragged children chased the well-fed across the square. Could you believe between sips of spiced ale that joy still flickered in these city veins? Literacy, though far from universal, offered an escape from physical squalor. Small lending libraries and reading rooms, funded by philanthropists or subscription fees, provided penny fiction, newspapers, and pamphlets on temperance or workers' rights. In flickering lamplight, readers immersed themselves in tales of daring explorers or moral tracts urging social reform. These bookshelves became classrooms and sanctuaries. A young apprentice, cradling Dickens' latest serial, could momentarily forget the clang of factory machines. A washerwoman, her hands raw from laundry, found solace in poems that spoke of beauty and loss? Could you, curled atop a rickety stool, lose yourself in print until the world's grime faded from your senses? Stately parish churches and humble mission chapels alike opened their doors to the needy. On cold mornings, vestry halls offered porridge and tea. On Sundays, pews filled with ragged coats and hopeful faces. Clergy delivered sermons on charity and perseverance, urging congregants to both give and receive kindness. Beneath vaulted ceilings, painted with angels and saints, worshippers lifted weary souls. The act of communal prayer bridged social divides. Wealthy benefactors shared pews with destitute emigrants, united in supplication. Could you feel uplifted, surrounded by hymns, even as the world outside remained unchanged? In the narrow lanes and crowded rooms, strangers relied on one another. A seamstress traded a patch of cloth for a shared loaf. A ship's fireman offered blankets to the newly orphaned. A bookbinder taught numeracy to a group of unemployed labourers. These reciprocal acts wove a social safety net far stronger than any official aid. Children learned from an early age the power of communal alliances. Siblings formed buddy systems to watch out for each other on factory floors. Street urchins pooled earnings to hire a guide through treacherous alleys. In times of riot, food shortages, wage disputes, neighbours banded together to protect homes and families. Could you have survived without these informal networks? As you rise from your stool, warmed by stew and ale, and step back into the damp London night, you carry more than a filled belly. You carry the collective strength of those who shared their scant resources. In these small comforts, music, food, friendship, lies a testament to human compassion amid hardship. The question is not whether you could survive alone, but whether you could endure without the gentle hands and open hearts of your community. Night's velvet cloak settles over Victorian London, yet the city's pulse never truly slows. The lamplight glimmers on sodden cobbles, and the distant hiss of steam engines lingers in the damp air. You have walked its dark dwellings, endured its killer smog, tasted its meagre gruel, sloshed through filth-choked streets, toiled in raucous factories, faced disease and quack cures, eluded grave robbers and gangs, and found solace in fleeting comforts. Now, as you pause beneath a flickering gas lamp, ask yourself, could you endure such relentless trials, and for how long? Survival in Victorian London was not a singular act of heroism, but a mosaic of tiny victories. Rising before dawn to navigate narrow corridors slick with mildew, clutching a tin bowl of watery gruel while your stomach gnawed in protest, slipping through alleys thick with horse manure and filth, each moment demanded both vigilance and acceptance. No one challenge stood alone. They intertwined, creating a grim tapestry of struggle. Could you steel your mind against the despair that seeped through every pore? The city's poverty wore on the spirit as much as on the body. Yet even in its bleakest corners you glimpsed humanity's stubborn light, a mother's lullaby whispered to calm, fevered children, a factory sweeper's bucket of water washing soot from a comrade's boots, a ragged group of neighbours pooling pennies for a sack of coal. These acts of compassion were small, but in a world so hostile, small kindnesses became lifelines. Consider the tenement dweller who patched leaky ceilings with scrap cloth, rigged oil lamps from discarded bottles, and rigged makeshift traps against ravenous rats. Imagine the smog-choked mill worker who sang under her breath to steady frayed nerves, or the child labourer who learned to read by the dim glow of a pint-pot lamp. Over and over, London's poor crafted solutions from the city's refuse, mending broken lives with hope's frayed threads. Their resilience was born of necessity. When rain flooded the cellars, neighbours waded in ankle-deep water to rescue blankets. When disease struck, families isolated the sick and kept vigil through agonizing nights. In the face of fear, they improvised, baking seed cakes to barter, for medicine, pooling labour to erect rudimentary sewer covers, or gathering around makeshift libraries to escape the grind through stories and song. Could you have adapted so swiftly, turning despair into resolve? Victorian London's splendour, its grand boulevards, opulent theatres, and glittering West End, rested on the backs of the destitute. The same coal that warmed parlours choked lungs. The same factories that propelled industry maimed children. The same streets that dazzled visitors repelled residents with stench. Progress, measured in steam and steel, carved a chasm between wealth and want. As you glimpse the glittering facades of royal palaces or watch carriages glide along polished avenues, remember the shadows that lurked just out of sight. Each triumph of technology carried human tolls, families torn apart by workhouse policies, bodies bartered to surgeons' tables, communities fractured by grime and fear. The cost of modernity was written in coughs and calluses, in the hollow eye sockets of starving children, and in the memory of every cheap gin den that offered oblivion. Though the smogs have cleared and labour laws protect children, echoes of Victorian hardships still resonate. In cities around the world, slums burgeon where sanitation fails, factories exploit vulnerable workers, and communities scramble for basic necessities. The endurance you witnessed in London's poorest quarters illuminates both the depths of suffering and the heights of human solidarity. Ask yourself, when confronted with overwhelming adversity, would you rally your neighbours to fill a coal basket, share your meagre rations, or nurse a stranger through illness? Could you transform fear into action, resentment into compassion, and desperation into creativity? The spirit of the Victorian underclass offers a blueprint for resilience, a reminder that compassion and community can prevail when institutions falter. Now, as gas lamps flicker and midnight tolls echo across river and street, ponder this. If you were dropped into that world, hungry, cold, and besieged, what choice would define you? Would you eke out survival through cunning and grit? Or would you falter beneath the city's relentless weight? More importantly, could you extend your hand to someone staggering beside you, forging a bond stronger than any iron chain? In the end, survival was never merely a personal feat, but a collective endeavour. Each crumb shared, each quilt patched, each whispered warning against grave robbers wove together a fragile safety net. The poorest Londoners taught us that in the face of every horror, be it filth, famine, or fear, humanity endures through empathy and solidarity. So step back into your world, carry this lesson close, and remember, no darkness is too deep when the light of shared compassion guides the way. Dawn's pale glow crosses the Thames as you linger in the mist, the city's symphony of whistles, clatters, and coughing fits resuming its relentless rhythm. You've walked the tenements, tasted despair and solidarity, and breathed the very air that forged London's underclass. Before you step forward to the tales of ancient Sparta and desert palaces, take a moment to reflect and to decide what comes next. You've witnessed daily heroism in the face of squalor, families sharing a single crust, neighbours braving floodwaters to save blankets, children huddled in doorways for warmth and companionship. These acts, though small, wove a lifeline across the city's bleakest quarters. Now, as you catch your breath, ask yourself, which story moved you most? Was it the resilience of the millworker, the bravery of the mudlark, or the compassion of the pub's hearth? Behind us lies the crucible of Victorian London, but the world's tapestry of survival stretches far beyond these soot-blackened streets. Next, we turn to part 2, Queen Gorgo of Sparta, a woman whose political cunning and moral strength shaped one of history's most legendary defences. Unlike London's faceless masses, Gorgo stood at the centre of court intrigues and battlefield councils, wielding her voice as deftly as any general. As you prepare to journey from London's gutters to Sparta's agoras, remember your own power. As a storyteller, your like, your share, and your comments breathe life into these narratives, ensuring they reach ears that need to hear them. If you found value, strike that like button, subscribe for the full series, and ring the bell so no chapter slips through the fog of history. Before you go, ponder this. Survival is both deeply personal and profoundly communal. In London, It was forged through shared loaves and whispered warnings. In Sparta, through council chambers and battlefield oaths. Which world would you choose? And what lessons will you carry forward? Imagine standing at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, the sea on one side and towering cliffs on the other. A chill wind tugs at your crimson cloak, carrying the distant thunder of millions of Persian soldiers, an unstoppable tide waiting to crash upon the slender line of defenders. Yet here, at the heart of this crucible, stands not just a king, but a queen whose single word can reshape destiny. Could a woman's counsel tilt the scales of war and alter the fate of an empire? Queen Gorgo of Sparta was no mere ornament in the palace. In an age when power was measured in bronze shields and sharpened spears, she wielded influence through intellect, persuasion, and an unbreakable will. As dawn's first light brushed the jagged peaks, Gorgo surveyed the gathering storm with calm resolve in her eyes. She understood that true strength lay not only in brawn, but in the courage to speak truth, even when voices trembled. Beneath the marble columns of the Spartan agora, rumors swirled of the coming invasion. Envoys traveled dusty roads bearing warnings of Persian legions approaching from the east. Citizens fretted in their tunics. Elders nodded gravely. Soldiers sharpened their blades. Yet it was Gorgo who, with measured steps and unwavering gaze, reminded them of Sparta's covenant, to stand firm or perish with honor. In her presence, fear found no purchase. Could you have matched her resolve as banners snapped in the wind, and hearts pounded with foreboding? Gorgo was born around 510 BC, the daughter of King Cleomenes the Firm and Queen Cleomnestra. From her earliest years, she dwelt within Sparta's austere courts, where luxury was scorned and discipline revered. Unlike other Greek princesses who learned delicate arts, Gorgo's education was steeped in the martial and civic virtues that defined Lacedaemonian life. By age 7, Gorgo entered the famed agoge system, the rigorous training program that molded Sparta's future warriors and citizens. Far from pampered upbringing, girls of noble birth endured physical contests alongside their male peers. They raced across rocky hillsides, wrestled in open courtyards, and hurled javelins with precision. This unorthodox regimen forged resilience. Young Gorgo learned to bear pain without complaint, to persevere when breath came in ragged gasps, and to command respect among peers through fair competition. Yet the agoge was not solely physical. Tutors guided her through the principles of Spartan law, Lycurgos's unwritten codes that prized communal loyalty over individual comfort. Under torchlit evenings, she studied the annals of past kings, the speeches of Helot revolts, and the laconic epigrams that captured Sparta's ethos in succinct phrasing. Poetry and choral song played their part too. Young Gorgo memorized hymns extolling Artemis and Athena, internalizing ideals of courage, wisdom, and tempered pride. Unlike women in other Greek states, Spartan women enjoyed remarkable freedoms. They owned property, managed estates while men campaigned, and participated in public festivals. Gorgo's formative years included observing the assembly, ecclesia, from specially erected stands. Though she could not vote, the debates, heated and eloquent, shaped her understanding of governance. She watched elders argue taxation, conscription, and alliances, noting how persuasion, rhetoric, and moral authority swayed decisions even in a society anchored by martial might. By adolescence, Gorgo demonstrated a rare blend of poise and passion. She excelled in athletics, winning foot races and javelin contests, and matched male counterparts in wrestling bouts. Yet her true gift lay in conversation. She questioned generals on tactics, challenged philosophers on virtue, and persuaded merchants to contribute grain for communal reserves. Observers whispered that her steadiness under pressure rivaled that of Spartan kings. Could you have held your own in such a crucible of excellence and expectation? At home, Gorgo's mother, Cleomnestra, instilled the values of loyalty and discretion. Court life demanded delicate balance, entertained dignitaries without showing favoritism, maintained Spartan simplicity, even as foreign ambassadors marveled at bronze and ivory artworks. and uphold austerity despite royal privileges. Gorgo learned to listen, truly listen, to concerns whispered in palace corridors, whispers of dissent among nobles, murmurs of fear among helot populations, and rumors of Persian designs on Greek city-states. Her father, King Cleomenes, involved her in diplomatic councils, valuing her insight on alliances with Athens and Thebes. She observed him navigate the treacherous currents of interstate politics, bribery attempts, clandestine intrigues, and the ever-present threat of civil discord. In doing so, Gorgo honed an acute political acumen. She recognized that the mightiest phalanx could crumble if those within its ranks succumbed to envy or rash counsel. Under the twin suns of Sparta's clear sky, alliances were forged as much by marriage as by the forging of shields. When Gorgo wed Leonidas, an unlikely union of two royal lines, it wasn't merely a matter of love or dynastic convenience. It was a pact sealed in crimson and bronze, one that would resonate on battlefields half a world away. Gorgo and Leonidas married in her early teens, a match arranged to unite the Agiad and Eurypontid houses. Yet theirs was no ornamental marriage. From the moment she stepped into the royal chamber, Gorgo asserted herself as partner and advisor. She observed Leonidas during council meetings, noting how his furrowed brow eased when she reminded him of Sparta's core tenets: loyalty above self, discipline above desire. In the hallowed Senate hall, Gorgo's presence commanded quiet respect. When whispers of Persian overtures reached Sparta, many elders panicked, urging appeasement. Into that storm, Gorgo stepped forward, her voice calm, yet unwavering. Better to meet death with shields raised than live in submission under foreign masters. Her words echoed through the marble columns, silencing dissent. Leonidas, buoyed by her conviction, found the courage to rally the ephors, Sparta's magistrates, to sanction a stand at Thermopylae. It was Gorgo's careful framing of Spartan honor that transformed fear into resolve. Beyond internal debates, Gorgo undertook discreet diplomatic missions to neighboring city-states. In Corinth, she negotiated grain supplies. In Athens, she secured volunteer hoplites. Cloaked and traveling incognito, she gathered intelligence on Persian troop movements and morale. At each stop, she employed a blend of gravitas and grace, quoting Spartan proverbs to win trust. When word spread that the Spartan queen had crossed the isthmus, allies rallied behind Sparta's cause, impressed by her unorthodox and effective approach. 3 narrow passes, scorching sun, and a cliff to one side. This was Thermopylae, the stage of hot gates. Here, 300 Spartans and a few thousand allies would face a Persian horde, said to number in the hundreds of thousands. Their mission: hold the pass until reinforcements could arrive or die trying. And at the heart of this grim determination stood Gorgo's whispered words, guiding strategy as surely as any general's map. As dawn broke in late August of 480 BC, Leonidas and his council studied the rocky terrain. The pass measured barely 50 feet across, ideal for negating Persian numerical advantage. Yet flanking routes threatened to outmaneuver the defenders. It was then that Gorgo's intelligence network proved invaluable. She had intercepted reports of a goat track snaking along the hills, which, if unguarded, would allow Persian forces to encircle the Greeks. Under Gorgo's counsel, Leonidas dispatched a small detachment of local Phocian guides to hold the goat path. Meanwhile, he ordered the bulk of his hoplites to fortify the main pass, erecting hastily hewn breastworks from loose stone. At night, the Spartans feigned reduced numbers by lighting extra torches, tricking the Persians into believing they faced more men. These tactics bought crucial days. Before the final engagement, Gorgo's words reached the Spartan camp via trusted runners. Stand fast with honor, for your deeds will echo through history. Let no fear cloud your hearts. Remember that your shield bears not only bronze but the hopes of Sparta. These messages arrived with fresh water and hard-baked loaves, a silent reminder of home. Soldiers pressed the parchment to their chests, steeling themselves for the coming onslaught. The moral uplift was tangible. Tired eyes flashed with renewed determination, and weary muscles found extra strength. On the third day, Xerxes unleashed wave after wave of Iranian archers and hoplites. Arrows blotted out the sky and ground fought, back with Persian scimitars. Yet the narrow pass funneled attackers into a mortal gauntlet. Leonidas's Spartan shield wall held firm, each hoplite's phalanx covering his comrade's flank. When the goat path was discovered, the Phocian detachment fought to the last man, delaying the envelopment. Though ultimately outflanked, the Spartans, guided by Gorgo's strategic foresight, exacted devastating losses before making their heroic, final stand. Their sacrifice fulfilled its purpose. It granted Greece time to mobilize and forge alliances that would repel the Persian tide at Salamis and Plataea. When the battle horns of Thermopylae fell silent and Leonidas's last stand ended in sacrifice, Sparta mourned its king, but it did not crumble. At the palace gates, Queen Gorgo gazed upon the assembled ephors and elders, her crimson cloak now edged with sorrow, yet undimmed in purpose. In that moment, she transformed from consort to regent, wielding a subtler but no less formidable weapon, the art of soft power. In the weeks following the pass's fall, political tensions simmered. Some ephors advocated retreat and appeasement. Others saw opportunity in shifting alliances. Gorgo entered council chambers bearing the weight of widow's veil, her voice steady as she reminded them of Spartan ideals. A king may fall, but a queen's counsel endures. Her measured grief lent moral authority to her words, compelling magistrates to uphold Leonidas's legacy rather than capitulate. Her son, Cleombrotus I, was barely of age when his father perished. As regent, Gorgo assumed guardianship of the heir and stewardship of the realm. She supervised his education, ensuring he absorbed lessons in martial discipline, diplomatic finesse, and legislative scrutiny. Under her guidance, Cleombrotus gained confidence in the assembly, delivering speeches on helot reforms and frontier defenses that reflected his mother's balanced approach. Gorgo's regency emphasized alliances over conquest. Recognizing Sparta's reduced manpower, she brokered treaties with Argos and Mantinea, securing mutual defense pacts in exchange for grain shipments and shared training exercises. Her envoys, often female relatives and trusted mentors, traveled in quiet delegations, diffusing Spartan rigidity with courteous respect. These missions laid groundwork for the Hellenic League, which would later coalesce under Theban leadership, but bore early hallmarks of Gorgo's coalition-building ethos. Understanding that hearts could be won through culture, Gorgo sponsored choral competitions and festivals in honor of Artemis Orthia. She funded sculptors to carve commemorative reliefs of Thermopylae's heroes, placing them in the agora to remind citizens of shared sacrifice. Poets and playwrights, under her patronage, composed paeans extolling civic virtue, subtly embedding messages of unity and resilience. Through these public spectacles, Gorgo shaped public sentiment, demonstrating that a queen's soft power could rival a general's spear. Centuries have passed since the stones of Thermopylae drank Spartan blood, yet the name Gorgo endures, etched in history and myth alike. From the pages of Herodotus to modern silver screen epics, her story resonates as proof that leadership transcends gender and that true power often lies in words, not weapons. But what lessons does her legacy hold for us today? Herodotus's Histories provides one of the earliest glimpses of Gorgo's stature. When asked why Spartan women were the only ones who ruled men, she replied, "Because we are also born of men." This laconic retort encapsulates her blend of wit and confidence. Later writers, Plutarch, Isocrates, echoed her deeds, framing Gorgo as exemplar of Spartan womanhood, disciplined, wise, and unflinchingly proud. In Renaissance Europe, Gorgo appeared in courtly masks and emblem books as a paragon of virtuous regency. Neoclassical painters captured her regal profile, draping her in crimson and ivory against the rugged pass. In the 20th century, novels and films most famously the 300 Spartans and its subsequent adaptations, revived her image, though often sidelining her voice. Modern historians work to reclaim her narrative, spotlighting archival evidence of her diplomatic missions and regency decrees. Today, Gorgo stands alongside figures like Eleanor of Aquitaine and Catherine de' Medici as an early female stateswoman. Leadership courses cite her as case study in soft power and crisis management, emphasizing her capacity to leverage moral authority and cultural influence. Her example underscores that decisive action need not crucify compassion, a balance appraised in contemporary governance and organizational theory. Gorgo's journey, from warrior princess to strategic consort, acceding to regency in grief to cultural patron, illuminates the multifaceted nature of leadership. She taught Sparta that the mightiest armaments falter without unified will, and that a ruler's greatest weapon can be the trust and goodwill of the governed. In our own lives, her legacy invites us to consider: how do we wield influence in moments of crisis? Do we steel hearts with inspiring words, forge unity through shared sacrifice, or shape culture to reflect our highest ideals? As we close the chapter on Gorgo's saga, imagine standing again at Thermopylae's narrow pass. The wind carries echoes of past struggles, the clash of bronze, the murmur of counsel, the hush before dawn's charge. And there beside you stands a queen whose voice shaped events as much as any spear. What counsel would you offer in that hallowed place? And in your own life, whose counsel do you heed, or whose might do you follow? Picture the sun dipping low, casting an otherworldly glow across desert sands. A solitary silhouette, walls of ivory-hued stone and graceful arches, stands against the horizon, wind whispering secrets through its half-dismantled towers. What messages did these silent stones once whisper to the desert winds, and what stories waited beneath their crumbling facades? As twilight cloaks the barren landscape, the Umayyad desert castles emerge like mirages, each one a testament to ambition, artistry, and authority. Here, in lands where daytime heat can scorch the earth and nights drop to biting coolness, rulers erected palaces and fortresses, not merely for defense, but as statements of power carved directly from the sand. In their symmetry and scale, one senses a bold assertion that even in the harshest realm, human ingenuity can forge havens of luxury, diplomacy, and spectacle. When the desert wind rattles loose stones along fractured walls, it carries echoes of banquet laughter, caravan dust, and diplomatic parley. It murmurs of caliphs and merchants negotiating amid mosaic halls, of poets composing verses under moonlit vaults, and of sentinels scanning the dunes for approaching threats. These castles, half submerged in time, beckon us to ask, what drove a dynasty to leave such monumental footprints in unforgiving terrain? And what lessons do their silent ramparts hold for us today? In the aftermath of the Rashidun Caliphate, the Umayyad dynasty, 661–750 AD, ascended as the first hereditary Islamic empire, stretching from the Atlantic coasts of Iberia to the fertile valleys of the Oxus River. This vast realm, held together by the twin engines of faith and commerce, needed more than mere administrative centers. It needed symbols of unity, control, and grandeur placed strategically across newly conquered territories. The deserts of the Levant and Transjordan formed vital arteries for trade caravans carrying silk, spices, and precious metals between east and west. Yet these routes were perilous, beset by raiders, Bedouin contingencies, and extreme weather. The Umayyad caliphs, keenly aware of the economic importance of safe passage, commissioned the construction of desert castles, known in Arabic as qasr, singular, or qusur, plural, to serve as fortified way stations, administrative hubs, and occasional royal retreats. Each castle played multiple roles: military outpost, guarding caravan routes and nearby oases. These fortresses housed garrisons ready to repel threats. Their thick walls, crenellated towers, and limited entry points created defensible strongholds in an otherwise open landscape. Administrative centre. Caliphal officials collected taxes, regulated grain shipments, and adjudicated disputes between nomadic tribes and settled communities. Courtyards and chambers served as offices, audience halls, and record-keeping rooms. Diplomatic venue. Envoys from Byzantium, Persia, and local tribal chiefs were entertained under vaulted ceilings, fostering alliances through feasts and ceremonial receptions. These gatherings projected Umayyad sophistication and magnanimity. Pleasure palace. Far from the front lines, caliphs and governors indulged in hunting expeditions, leisurely baths, and artistic pursuits. The castle's elaborate bathhouses, frescoed walls, and private apartments provided sanctuaries of refined comfort. Building in the desert required practical innovations. Architects harnessed locally quarried limestone and basalt, setting blocks without mortar in some cases to accommodate thermal expansion. Vaulted ceilings and domed chambers trapped cooler air at floor level, mitigating daytime heat. Small window openings reduced sun glare, but allowed cross-ventilation when paired with strategically placed skylights. Moreover, water management was critical. Cisterns carved into bedrock collected winter rains, while channels, sometimes lined with plaster, transported runoff into underground reservoirs. These cisterns fed bathhouses, private fountains, and irrigated small gardens, where date palms and fruit trees flourished in an otherwise arid environment. Beyond their functional roles, desert castles broadcasted the Umayyad Caliph's message of continuity with Roman and Byzantine predecessors. They borrowed classical motifs, columns, arches, and decorative friezes, blending them with new Islamic artistic vocabularies. The result was architecture that both resonated with a cosmopolitan audience and asserted the caliphate's cultural legitimacy. In commissioning these structures, caliphs like Walid I and Hisham stamped their reigns across the landscape. Each casa bore inscriptions extolling the caliph's name and pious virtues, often in elegant Kufic script. Travelers encountered these monuments long before reaching major urban centers, reminded that the empire's authority extended even to the remotest dunes. Imagine stepping from sun-baked desert into a cool, vaulted hall where water trickles. From ornate channels and flickering lamps dance upon frescoed walls. Welcome to Qusayr Amra, the Umayyad pleasure palace, where rulers shed their armor for silk robes, and poetry echoed as readily as the call to prayer. Could such luxury ever flourish amid endless dunes? Perched atop a gentle rise in the high eastern Jordanian desert, Qusayr Amra stands apart for its unabashed celebration of life's sensuous pleasures. Constructed circa 715-723 AD under Caliph Walid II, its central bath complex combines practical hygiene with exquisite artistry. A barrel-vaulted corridor leads visitors through a changing room into the heart of the hammam, a rectangular water basin framed by blind horseshoe arches, their stucco reliefs shimmering like ice beneath torchlight. But the true marvel lies overhead and on the chamber walls. In the apse, a painted zodiac unfurls across the dome, Sagittarius and Capricorn peering down in deep lapis blue fields studded with stars. Below, scenes of princely hunting depict well-dressed nobles pursuing gazelles and antelope, their garments rendered in vibrant ochre and rich emerald. One fresco shows a crowned figure lounging beside a wine cup, an iconoclastic nod to indulgence later condemned by stricter Abbasid successors. The reclining figure, often identified as Walid II himself, raised eyebrows even in Umayyad times. It speaks to a court culture that prized both martial prowess and refined leisure. Amid battle spoils and tax revenues, the caliph could commission artisans from Byzantine workshops to apply gilded stucco and imported pigments, status symbols signaling the caliphate's vast reach. Qusayr. Amra's engineering feats match its artistic flourishes. Hippocaust ovens channeled warm air beneath the marble floor, heating the hot rooms, caldaria, while cooler spaces maintained temperate comfort. Windows set high in the southern wall admitted soft daylight, balanced by lanterns hung on iron brackets. Water, drawn from nearby springs, flowed through lead-lined channels into both pool and basin, providing soothing acoustics that masked distant camel caravans. Inscriptions carved in elegant Kufic script remind visitors of the palace's function and patron. This work was completed for the servant of God, Walid, the emir, son of Abd al-Malik. Below, aphorisms celebrate the flow of time and water as divine gifts, subtle reminders that even earthly pleasures derive from a higher power. Far from bustling Damascus, Qusayr Amra offered an oasis of opulence and diplomacy. Delegations from tribes and neighboring courts attended lavish receptions here, feasting on roasted lamb, sweetmeats, and spiced wine, while poets declaimed odes to the caliph's glory. At night, the pool's reflective surface mirrored the frescoed vault, creating the illusion of sleeping beneath the heavens themselves. Yet this pleasure palace also carried strategic weight. Its location midway, between Syria and the pilgrimage routes to Mecca, allowed Umayyad governors to host dignitaries en route, projecting both hospitality and imperial might. In the harsh desert, where life hinged on shade and water, Qusayr Amra stood as a testament to what wealth and vision could achieve, even in exile from the capital. As dawn's first rays gild the desert sands, two contrasting Qusur emerge. Qasr al-Kharana, a humble way station where weary caravans found rest and repair, and Qasr al-Mashata, an ambitious palace whose half-built walls whisper of interrupted ambitions. What tales do these two structures tell of empire, commerce, and cultural exchange? Built around 710-714 AD, Qasr al-Kharana sits in stark simplicity. A roughly square enclosure, its two-story facade pierced by narrow arched windows and flanked by cylindrical towers. Unlike Qusayr Amra's ornate frescoes, al-Kharana's walls bear geometric patterns molded into plaster, a testament to Umayyad restraint and function. Layout and function. A single entry gate led into a central courtyard where camels and horses were watered. Side chambers provided sleeping mats on raised platforms, while storage niches held grains and oils. A raised projection, or kasera, served as a lookout for approaching traders, ensuring timely hospitality. Social hub. Here, Bedouin herders, Syrian merchants and pilgrims mingled. By lantern light they bartered wares, shared news of political unrest, and swapped stories of distant lands. In the cool of the evening, guests gathered around a communal hearth where pots of stew simmered and the call to prayer blended with crackling flame. Architectural note. Though built with local limestone and basalt, Al-Kharana's masonry reveals Roman-style coursing, rows of dressed blocks alternating with rubble infill. This hybrid technique underscores the Umayyad penchant for borrowing and adapting regional building traditions. Further north, Qasr al-Mashata presents a stark counterpoint. Commissioned by Caliph al-Walid Wan in the early 740s, its grand facade, once stretched over 200 meters, now partially lost to time. The surviving section, in Berlin's Pergamon Museum, displays intricate friezes carved with vine scrolls, acanthus leaves, and mythical creatures, blending Byzantine naturalism with emerging Islamic abstraction. Intended grandeur, plans included a monumental audience hall, private apartments, and an expansive central courtyard. The palace would have featured a covered walkway with colonnaded arches, punctuated by ornate panels praising the caliph's piety and power. Abandonment and legacy, political upheaval, the Abbasid Revolution of 750 AD halted construction. Workers abandoned tools and scaffolding mid-task, leaving uncarved blocks and half-set mortar as silent witnesses. Yet even in ruin, al-Mashata's decorative fragments influenced later Islamic art, inspiring geometric and vegetal motifs across the empire. Symbolic duality, al-Kharana and al-Mashata together encapsulate the Umayyad vision: one castle, a utilitarian node in commercial networks, the other an emblem of regal aspiration. Their proximity suggests an intentional dialogue between the mundane and the magnificent, the everyday journey and the grandiose court. Between these two kusur, camel caravans threaded silk, spices, and scholars across continents. As merchants paused at Al-Qarana, they encountered inscriptions in Arabic and Greek, reflecting a multilingual milieu. Artisans brought techniques from Byzantine workshops and Sasanian courts, fusing them in local kilns. In turn, al-Mashata's motifs travelled westward, appearing in Andalusian palaces centuries later. Could you, journeying by camel beneath the scorching sun, appreciate how each stone bound distant cultures, an Umayyad commission bridging empires through architecture? These castles remain monuments not only to political power, but to the human impulse to create beauty and community even amid isolation. Step back from the desert sands and gaze upon these desert castles' intricate masonry, where Roman arches, Byzantine mosaics, and Persian motifs converge in a harmonious chorus of stone and stucco. What alchemy forged such elegant fusion amid the shifting dunes? And how did builders balance aesthetic ambition with the harsh demands of the wilderness? The Umayyad architects drew upon a rich inheritance of building traditions. They borrowed Corinthian columns and semicircular arches from Roman precedents, while adopting Byzantine decorative vocabulary, mosaic tesserae, figurative frescoes, geometric reliefs, and married them to Sasanian vaulted forms and Persian vegetal patterns. At once familiar to diverse audiences and novel in its combinations, this stylistic synthesis signaled the caliphate's pluralistic identity. Arches and vaults. Roman barrel vaults appeared alongside horseshoe arches, above doorways, and alcoves, lending both strength and grace. In Qusayr Amra, intersecting barrel vaults created rhythmic bays, while at Qasr al-Mshata, shallow groin vaults distributed weight across slender piers, reducing the need for thick walls. Material palettes. Builders used local limestone and basalt for structural cores, then applied gypsum plaster for carving delicate motifs. In some bathhouses, they embedded polished marble slabs, reclaimed from Byzantine ruins, into walls and floors to reflect light and channel coolness. Surface decoration. Stucco screens at Al-Qarana showcased repeating geometric star patterns, an early Islamic embrace of aniconism, while stone-carved friezes at Al-Mashata depicted scrolling vines and mythical beasts echoing Persian rock reliefs. These decorative choices balanced religious sensibilities with visual splendor. Desertic streams demanded ingenious solutions. Thermal mass. Thick masonry absorbed heat by day and released it at night, mitigating temperature swings. Room. Orientation. Long axes facing north-south minimized direct sun exposure. Wind catchers. Narrow openings at roof level captured prevailing breezes, funneled them down through domed chambers, and vented stale air, a precursor to the later Badgeir towers of Persia. Waterproofing. Lime-based plasters mixed with volcanic ash sealed cistern walls against seepage. Channels sloped gently to ensure complete drainage, preventing rot and salt buildup. Beyond function, these architectural elements told layered stories. Imperial continuity. By echoing Roman and Byzantine forms, the Umayyads claimed inheritance of classical empires. A visiting Byzantine envoy would recognize familiar columns and arches, yet find new inscriptions in elegant Kufic script. Spiritual resonance. Geometric patterns. Circles within squares. Stars within. Rosettes evoked cosmic harmony, suggesting that divine order extended from the heavens into these desert retreats. Visitors saw in each interlaced motif an affirmation of unity amid diversity. Could you, standing beneath a cool vault in the midday heat, trace these varied influences, recognizing echoes of far-flung capitals in each carved curve, and feel the pulse of an empire that bridged continents through stone? As the sun sets on these desert ramparts, contemplate the political and cultural messages etched into every architrave and mihrab. These kusur were more than resting places. They were living manifestos of Umayyad authority, artistry, and vision. What legacies did they bequeath to later Islamic dynasties? And what lessons do they whisper to us across the centuries? Imperial branding. Each castle bore dedicatory inscriptions praising the caliph, his lineage, his piety, and his beneficence. Travellers, upon reading these carved texts, were reminded that beyond the horizon lay the caliph's reach and protection. The kushur served as roadside billboards of sovereignty. Diplomatic theatre. Festivities held in these halls were carefully choreographed displays of hospitality. Seated beneath mosaic-clad domes, tribal leaders and foreign emissaries shared wine and poetry, rituals that reinforced alliances and conveyed magnanimity. Through architecture itself, the Umayyads staged the theatre of politics. Economic control. By securing caravan routes with fortified way stations, the caliphs safeguarded the lifeblood of commerce: silk, spices, incense, flowing from east to west. Each kusur functioned as a customs post where taxes were levied and spoilage minimized, ensuring steady revenue for the state. These desert castles crystallized a moment of cross-cultural fertilization. Artisan networks, masons, stucco workers, and painters traveled from Syria, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia, sharing techniques and iconographies. Their workshops became crucibles where local and imported traditions melded, giving rise to a distinct Umayyad idiom that influenced later Abbasid and Andalusian styles. Literary patronage. Alongside architectural patronage, Umayyad elites sponsored poets who composed odes to these castles, praising their marble halls and cistern gardens. These verse collections circulated in scribal circles, immortalizing the castles in literary memory. Technological transmission. Engineering solutions developed here: hypocaust heating, wind-catching apertures, cistern networks, migrated to new contexts. In the Maghreb and Al-Andalus, builders adapted these features to coastal climates, seeding the later rise of palatial complexes like Madinat al-Zahra. Adaptation and innovation. The kusur teach that architecture must respond to environment as well as ideology. By synthesizing diverse traditions and addressing desert extremes, the Umayyads modeled how cultural exchange and technical ingenuity can transform hardship into opportunity. Soft power in stone. Beyond walls and battlements, these castles wielded influence through their beauty and hospitality. They remind us that leadership flourishes not only through force, but through generosity, cultural patronage, and the forging of shared experiences. Legacy of fusion. In an age defined by religious and ethnic plurality, the Umayyad desert castles stand as early proofs that unity need not erase difference. Their layered art and architecture celebrate multiplicity, offering a blueprint for harmonious coexistence. So, as you depart these silent ruins, dust swirling at your heels, consider this. In our own era of boundary walls and cultural divides, could we carve bridges instead of barriers? Could we, like the Umayyad builders, fashion spaces that welcome strangers, showcase shared artistry, and stand as timeless testaments to the power of collaboration?